All right, turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 33. Genesis 33, we're making a dent in the book of Genesis. And I'll have to tell you that my study in the book of Genesis, I've never really gone into as much depth as I've gone into with Genesis. And it's been a real blessing for me to see how God has worked in the lives of these characters and to see what God has done in their lives and how He often operates in our life. This is part 2 of surrender and reconciliation. We're looking at the life of Jacob and how he surrendered to God and how he's going to be reconciled to his brother. Do you ever struggle with surrender like I do? Now, obviously, we surrender to God initially at salvation, but then there is that ongoing surrender that Romans chapter 12 talks about where we present ourselves as living sacrifices to God. And so we're going to look at some of the principles tonight of surrender and how it's a struggle in our life, but also the issue of reconciliation. Have you ever had a conflict with somebody else? Have you ever had a falling out where you've had to deal with that relationship? Sometimes relationships can be very painful, they can be very difficult, and sometimes you separate because of irreconcilable differences. Reconciliation is not always possible, but we'll look at some principles tonight on the issue of reconciliation. Now remember, Genesis is a book of basically beginnings. And what it shows us is, first of all, the beginning of creation. It also shows us the beginning of man. It shows us the beginning of sin and judgment. We also see the beginning of the first promise where God in Genesis 3:15 presents the message of hope in the gospel after man falls into sin. And then we see the beginning of the nations, how many nations are formed in Genesis chapters 10 and 11. But the crucial point that we're looking at now is beginning in Genesis chapter 12, we're looking at the beginning of the nation of Israel. And in order to form the nation of Israel through whom the Messiah would ultimately come and fulfill Genesis 3:15, God has got to build that nation. And He's using what we would call the patriarchal fathers. Patriarch is someone who oversees a tribe or a group of people. And so we've looked at Abraham, we've looked at Isaac, and now we're looking at the life of Jacob. And specifically, we're looking at how God worked in the life of Jacob to bring about His purposes. Now, before we get into chapter 33, let me sort of rewind here and let us review to bring us up to the point of chapter 33. If you remember that basically Jacob was a deceiver. In fact, while he was in the womb, God had prophesied that Jacob, though being the younger, would be a deceiver. He's called a heel grabber because he was grabbing his brother's heel on the way out. And what he did was he stole his brother's blessing and he stole his brother's birthright. And as a result, that created a lot of acrimony in the relationship with his brother Esau. And at the behest of his mother, Jacob decides to flee because Esau, his brother, having been deceived, wants to kill his brother. And so he leaves to go up about 500 miles to the area where Abraham is from. It's called Padam Aram. That is the area of the Ur of Chaldees. That would be today the equivalent of the Persian Gulf. And so he goes up 500 miles to this particular area, and while he's there, by God's providence, he ends up meeting his uncle Laban. That would be his mother's brother. And while he's there, he ends up marrying 2 women, Rachel and Leah, and of course he had relations with their 2 servant ladies, Bilhah and Zilpah. And as a result, with these 4 women, while he's up in that area, he produces the 12 sons and 1 daughter, and this would be considered to be the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, he works for Laban for about 20 years. It's hard labor. Laban actually mistreated him and basically deceived him out of wages. And so, after 20 years of being up in Padam Aram, he now is going to come back to the promised land. God is going to instruct him to return, but he realizes that he has to face his brother. We don't know how he got the information, but he knows that his brother is coming out to meet him. And so Esau, or rather Jacob, is very, very scared. And if you'll notice on the map here, in chapter 32, you'll notice Jacob's route. He's coming down from the north, and you'll notice Esau from the south is coming up. and Jacob is at the Jabbok River there. And he's very, very fearful because he's thinking that his brother wants to seek revenge on him because 20 years earlier he had stole his blessing and his birthright. And it's in the midst of his fear, it's in the midst of his brokenness that God had him exactly where he wanted him. Because Jacob not only feared for his own life, he feared for the life of his young children as well as his wives. And so God has got him in a rock and a hard place. And you know, that's many times where God often brings us to the point of surrender. We may surrender to God initially at salvation, but what happens is if we take back the reins, God will allow circumstantially things in our life that will often put us in the vice grip that will force us to surrender to Him. Now, I say force because sometimes Christians are so recalcitrant, they don't want to surrender to God. And they keep running from God their whole life. And many times God cannot use them the way He wants to use them. But God has got Jacob where He wants him, and He uses three things to sort of get Jacob to surrender. You'll notice them up on the screen. The first thing is Jacob prays out of desperation while claiming God's promises. He says, God, when you called me to leave, you promised me that you would protect me on my journey and you would prosper me. And so now that I'm coming back to the homeland, I'm claiming your promise that you're going to protect me. Don't we do that when we're facing crises in our life? We get on our knees in desperation and we say, God, I claim your promises. We stand on the promises of God, and we should do that. But there's a second thing. Jacob wrestles with God all night. Sort of a cameo appearance of God. God comes in human form. He wrestles with Jacob. And what happens is Jacob is broken at that point because he's wrestling with God. And you know what? We know he changed because God changed his name. He went from Jacob, which is basically a deceiver or a heel grabber. He now becomes Israel, which means one who is ruled by God. And so the fact that God changed his name, in a sense, implies that Jacob's nature and his destiny is going to be changed. And then finally, God uses the fact that He gives him a permanent disability. He touches his hip as a perpetual reminder of his need and dependency upon God. And so Jacob has this experience, I believe, where he's now more fully surrendered to God. Many people believe that back in previous chapters, when Jacob was at a place called Peniel, that's where Jacob had that encounter with God where he saw the ladder with the angels ascending and descending. Many people believe that that was Jacob's conversion experience. Now we would say this is where Jacob surrenders, as to use New Testament terminology, he surrenders to the lordship of Christ. You know, a lot of Christians, this happens in their life. This happened to me. I came to Christ and I received Him as Savior. And for the first year, there wasn't a lot of change in my life. But after a year, I had an encounter with God where I surrendered on a deeper level. And for many Christians, that's their experience. They come to Christ, they have enough fruit in their life to show that they're saved, but they're not really surrendered like they should be. And let me say this, none of us are perfectly surrendered to God. Even after this, Jacob was still making mistakes. He was still sinning, just like you and I do. It is a growth process. But for many of us, there is this dichotomy between when we come to Christ, we receive Him as Savior, and then sometime later on, we surrender to Him as Lord. Now, I know there are theologians that say you can't do that. When you accept Jesus, you accept Him as Savior and Lord, and if He's not the Lord of your life at the moment of salvation, you're not saved. I disagree with them. I've seen this not only in my life, but in many Christians' lives. Maybe that's your experience. And so, he's here at a point of surrender, because he's desperate for God to work in his life. Well, having said that context, now we're going to pick up here in chapter 33, and we're going to see how he's about to meet his brother. After surrender, he's now going to reconcile with his brother. And what I want to share with you this evening is some of the principles of reconciliation. We looked at some of them last time in chapter 32. Let me review them with you, and then we'll pick up our narrative in chapter 33. And by the way, these principles are not in any particular order. And even if you follow these principles, it doesn't necessarily mean or guarantee that you're going to experience full reconciliation with someone that you are having conflict with. First of all, I noted for you last time that you must initiate reconciliation. Remember in chapter 32, verse 3, it says that Jacob sent messengers to Esau. He initiated the reconciliation process. I don't know exactly what his motive was. Obviously, he was fearful. He didn't want to have his life taken. But no doubt, I believe after his encounter with God, where he surrendered to God, I think Jacob probably realized that he had wronged his brother. And so if you want to see reconciliation, what does the Bible say you need to do? You've got to initiate reconciliation, even if you feel like you shouldn't be the one to initiate it. You have to take the higher ground. That's what a spiritually mature person does. What does Matthew 5 say? If you're offering up your offering and you know that someone has something against you, what does it say? Go to them. Or if you have something in your heart that you cannot let go of, the Bible says initiate reconciliation. Ephesians chapter 4 says, be quick to resolve. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. So initiate reconciliation. Secondly, show humility and respect towards the other person. Do you remember when he sent those servants to go to Esau? He says, here's what you're to tell Esau. He says, call him Lord. He says, my Lord. And then he said, I, your servant. Why was Jacob using this type of terminology? Because he had a sense of humility and he had a sense of respect towards his brother because he had a desire to reconcile. One of the things that hinders reconciliation more than anything else is an arrogant attitude. If you come into a relationship where you're having struggles and you have a pompous attitude, you have a condescending attitude, you use language that puts the other person down, and if you're married, you understand this because when you have fought with your spouse, have you ever used terminology that didn't go over too well? I have, and I got my ears boxed in the process. You got to show humility and respect towards the other person, even if you disagree with them. And then thirdly, by way of review, I noted for you that you must not assume what the other person is thinking or assume their potential responses. You see, when Jacob found out that Esau was coming with 400 men, what was the assumption that Jacob had? He assumed that Esau was bringing those 400 men because he was going to wipe out Jacob and his family. But that wasn't the case. He made an assumption. And you know what? When you and I assume, you know what it generates? It generates fear, and it also generates a separation mentality. You see, if I assume you don't want to talk to me, if I assume that you're angry at me and you're not interested in reconciliation, or if I assume what your motives are, you know what that does? That can hinder the process of reconciliation. And then finally, by way of review, in chapter 32, I noted for you the fourth principle of reconciliation, and that is pray about the situation. Isn't that what Jacob did? No doubt he fell on his knees and he cried out to God and he said, God, I'm asking you to deliver me from my brother, because his perception was Esau wanted to kill him. And he said, God, I'm asking you and I'm depending upon you to help me in this situation. If you're in a marriage where there's struggles, if you're having a problem with a relative, a parent, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's someone in the ministry, you know what? Pray about the situation and ask God to give you favor. Ask God to soften the person's heart that may not be interested in reconciling with you. Well, with that, let's pick up in chapter 33, beginning in verse 1. It says, Then Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. Like I said, he saw that as an ominous threat. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. He put the maids and their children in front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. Why did he put those in the back? Because he loved Rachel, and obviously Joseph was his favorite. We're going to get into that story, which is a great story. But he himself, verse 3, passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. Now, why would he bow down 7 times? Well, we know from archaeology and extra biblical literature that this was a Near Eastern custom. Again, it was a way that he would show respect to his brother. And then notice what happens. He's going through all this formality, and I love verse 4. It says, "Then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him." You can imagine the scene. You've seen this before where a brother and a sister haven't seen each other for 30 years, and what happens when they meet in the airport? They don't bow down and go through all these formalities, of course, unless you're from the East. What do? They embrace each other and they start to cry. Or you see a child with a parent. Well, Esau basically drops all the formalities, unlike Jacob, and he falls on his neck and he kisses him, and they both begin to cry together. These are grown men. These are brothers. They haven't seen each other in 20 years. Jacob is assuming that his brother wants to kill him, that he hates him. And so Esau drops all the formality and he shows uncontrolled affection. Now, here's another principle of reconciliation, and that is this. You need to show love and affection in your relationships. Now, I'm not saying every resolution that we have in a relationship will have uncontrolled emotions. You and I know that's not the case if we're married and we're arguing with our spouse. You and I have had falling outs with people, and when we reconcile, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have all these uncontrolled emotions and that we're going to fall on one another and kiss one another. However, we need to make sure that in our attitude and in our body language, listen carefully, there is an attitude of love and affection. Have you ever been in some type of conflict with somebody and you've reconciled and the person shows no emotion? They're stiffs. There's no sense of affection there. And I understand if you've hurt somebody deeply or they've hurt you deeply, the love and the affection may not come right away. I understand that. But if you're going to resolve issues with other people, there needs to be a sense of love, there needs to be a sense of care, and there needs to be a sense of affection. If you have a falling out with your child, and you sit down and you resolve the conflict with your child, and I understand sometimes it's different with a child than it is with a spouse or maybe a parent, but what do? I know when I've had conflicts with my daughters, whenever we've tried to resolve the conflict, one of the things that I do is I always hug them and I what? Kiss them. Spouses do this all the time. When they have fights with one another, they kiss and they make up, as we would say. There has to be some type of affection there. Because if there's no emotion, there's no affection, and you go, fine, okay, I forgive you, let's move on. What kind of attitude does that communicate? It doesn't communicate much. And so Esau here has much affection, and of course Jacob begins to open up and he weeps with him. Well, notice verse 5, it says, he lifted his eyes and saw the women, that is Esau, saw the women and the children, and said to his brother Jacob, who are these with you? So Jacob said, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. You see, he's still using that language of humility. Then the maids came near with their children in verse 6, and they bowed down. This again was custom in that day. Leah likewise came near with her children, and they bowed down. And afterwards Joseph came near with Rachel, and they bowed down. And he said in verse 8, what do you mean by all this company which I have met? What Esau is asking Jacob is this: before we actually met and embraced each other, you sent all of these servants and these animals in different waves. What is the meaning of that? Why did you do that? Well, of course, what Jacob was trying to do was he was trying to soften Esau's heart. In fact, I would say this: by him sending all of those people and those animals, that was Jacob's way of trying to find favor with Esau. It was Jacob's way of basically making a peace offering with his brother. He was saying, I don't want there to be anything between us. If I could say it frankly, you know what Jacob was doing in sending those waves of people and all those animals? He was saying to his brother, in a sense, I was wrong for what I did. That was the custom in that day. Because as we're going to see later, if Jacob, or rather Esau, did not receive all those animals and all those offerings, that would have communicated to his brother, I don't forgive you. And so what Jacob was doing here was he was admitting he was wrong. And this leads to the next principle of reconciliation. And that is this, and this is the hard one often for many of us. We must be willing to admit we are wrong and say we are what? Sorry. A lot of times that's hard, especially when you're in an argument with somebody and you don't feel like you have done something wrong. Now, I'm not saying that every time you have a falling out with your spouse or your children or your in-laws or whoever it may be or somebody in the church, if you haven't done anything wrong and they clearly have done something wrong, I'm not saying that you need to go and necessarily admit that you're wrong. I realize you may agree to disagree. But many times in relationships, we have to own up to what we have done wrong in the relationship. And I know there are times when I have had arguments with Laura, and I knew I was wrong, but you know what I did? I kept arguing with her. Have you ever done that before? Sure you have, because you have the same problem that I do, pride and ego. And sometimes it's hard to get out of our mouths that we're wrong. Sometimes it's hard when you're in the midst of an argument with somebody to stop and listen and to say this, you know what? You're right. I shouldn't have said that. You're right. My attitude stunk. Well, I didn't realize that that would have offended you, and I want to apologize to you. Sometimes we don't offend people on purpose. Sometimes we do. But one of the things that can diffuse an argument more than anything else is if you're willing to own up to your part and you're willing to say, I'm sorry. And if you're not willing to say you're sorry and you're not willing to apologize and admit that you're wrong, you have a pride problem. And I know there are people that have been married for years. I had a friend of mine, he said to me, I have been married 30 years. He said, my wife has only said sorry 2 times. I said, well, maybe you don't fight that much. I don't know. You got to be willing to admit that you're wrong. And a lot of times it's pride. It's hard to admit. And by the way, make sure that when you do apologize and you admit you're wrong, make sure it's genuine. Because you know what? If we come off very glib, well, I apologize, I'm sorry, let's move on. That person, if they sniff that there's no sincerity there, they're not going to receive your apology. They're going to think that there are ulterior motives there, or you're really not interested in reconciling in the relationship. I was reading this week about a guy, the article said this, after breaking up with his fiancée, a young man realized the error of his ways, and he wrote her a letter, and here's what it said. Dearest Marie, no words could ever express the great unhappiness I felt since the breakup of our engagement. Please say you'll take me back. No one could ever take your place in my heart, so please forgive me. I love you, and I am sorry. Yours forever, Jimmy. And then he put this, P.S., and congratulations on winning the lottery. What do you think his motive was in apologizing? Well, she's probably going to go, this guy is not sincere. He's after my money. And so make sure that it's sincere. And sometimes, you know what? We have to take the higher ground. There are times when I know Laura's taken the higher ground with me and I've taken the higher ground. Why? Because I want peace in the relationship. Sometimes there is a place for a win-win solution. Maybe you don't feel like you're as wrong as your spouse or that person thinks you are, but for the sake of peace, you're willing to say, you know what, I understand what you're saying, let's work on this together. You see, sometimes that's taking the higher ground. Well, let's pick up in verse 9. But Esau said, I have plenty, my brother. Let what you have be your own. So in other words, when he got all the waves of these animals, Esau says, look, I don't need any of this, Jacob. Jacob said, no, please. If now I have found favor in your sight, then take my present from my hand, for I see your face as one sees the face of God, and you have received me favorably. He says, I don't need all your stuff. He says, just to see you and to embrace you is enough for me. And so in verse 11, he says, please take my gift, which has been brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have plenty. In other words, they're going back and forth. Esau says, I don't want the gifts. Jacob says, no, please take the gifts. God has blessed me. And then it says, thus he urged him, and notice what Esau did. He took it. Now, you have to understand the customs in that day. You wouldn't get that from just reading the text itself. In that day, if Esau did not receive these gifts from his brother, he would have been communicating that he did not forgive his brother. And so here's the next principle of reconciliation. If you want to experience reconciliation in your relationship, you must be forgiving. Reconciliation cannot happen, listen carefully, if you hold a grudge and you will not forgive the other person. And you know, forgiveness is a choice. It's not always an emotion, because when someone has hurt you deeply, the last thing you want to do is forgive them. In fact, sometimes you can go for days, if not weeks or months, with not forgiving someone because you want to nurse that grudge. You don't want to forgive them because you feel like you're letting them off the hook. You want your pound of flesh. It feels good to hold on to the grudge. It feels good to fantasize about how you're going to give them a tongue lash. You see, forgiveness is a beautiful word until you have someone to forgive. And the greater the hurt, the harder it is to forgive. If someone says an unkind word to me, I can forgive them quickly. But if someone were to molest my daughter, I would find it very difficult to forgive them. The deeper the pain, the harder it is to forgive. But listen, forgiveness is a choice. It's not always an emotion. The Bible says that we are to choose to forgive other people. Why? Because God has forgiven us such a great debt. And you know, when I'm tempted to hold on to a grudge, when I'm tempted not to forgive my spouse or people in ministry, or in the years of ministry, people have hurt me, they've stabbed me in the back. When I'm tempted not to forgive them, I remind myself that God has forgiven me such a great debt. And I think of all the times that I've sinned against God. And when I sin against God, God pours upon me grace upon grace upon grace. And so how can I be so selfish as to take God's grace and forgiveness and not dispense it to other people who have offended me? And so that is a motivator for me. Now, you got to understand this distinction. There is a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. You have to understand that distinction. I can forgive somebody and not necessarily be reconciled to them in some senses. For example, here's a woman who's married to a man, and they have 3 children, and the husband ends up cheating on her, and he runs off with another woman. She has to choose to forgive her husband. You say, well, she shouldn't have to forgive him. No, the Bible does not say forgive only if this happens. She is commanded by God, and it may take some time because it's painful and it's a hard process, but she is commanded to forgive that husband. Now, she may forgive him, but she may not be reconciled to him. They may never get back together in their marriage because irreparable damage is done, and he may not want to get back in the marriage, and neither may she want to get back because infidelity has taken place. She can forgive them, forgive her husband, but they may not be reconciled. And so forgiveness is dependent upon me. Reconciliation is dependent upon us. There's a distinction there. I'm always required to forgive, but I may not be reconciled to that person. It doesn't always work that way. But here's the issue, people. If you want to see reconciliation, if there is the potential of reconciliation, you got to choose to forgive. Is there someone this evening that you're holding a grudge towards? Or bitterness? Is there someone that you're angry at? You have to choose to forgive them. I was reading a story that Chuck Swindoll tells about a seminary student who was living in Chicago, and he wanted to do a ministry job full time, but he couldn't find one. And so in the meantime, he decided to drive a bus in the south side of Chicago. Well, as he was driving the bus, some young kids came on the bus, and day after day, they would not pay their fare. And so finally, this young seminary student got fed up with it. And so while they were on the bus, he saw an officer. He pulled over, went and told the officer what was going on. The officer came on and made the young men pay the fare. But here was the problem. The officer exited the bus. And as soon as the seminary student began to take off and he got into another section, these young men ended up beating this seminary student. This is a true story. They beat him harshly, and they stole all the money from him. Well, he ended up filing a report. They rounded up the young men. They caught him, and they took him to court. And this seminary individual went to the court, and he made a stunning statement. He said to the judge, "I want you to know, Judge, that I forgive these young men for what they did for me." And he said this to the judge, "I would like to take their penalty for them." Well, the judge, he was stunned. So was these young kids. They were stunned. And the judge said, "Well, we can't do anything like that." And so the kids went to jail. And you know what he did? He went to the jail and visited those young men, and he led multitudes of them to Christ because he was willing to forgive. Now, I'm not saying it's always easy. It's not always easy. Well, let's pick up in verse 12 as we wind down. Then Esau said, "Let us take our journey and go. I've received your gifts, Jacob. Let's go together on the journey, and I'll go before you. I'll lead you back home." But he said to him in verse 13, "My Lord knows that the children are frail," they were young, "and that the flocks and herds which are nursing are a care to me. And if they are driven hard one day, all the flocks will die. Please let my Lord pass on before his servant, and I will proceed at my leisure according to the pace of the cattle that are before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord at Seir." Seir is Edom. That's where he lived. He says, "Look, I'd rather not you go with us because I've got to travel at a slower pace than you because of the young children, and I don't want to drive the cattle." Esau said to him in verse 15, "Please let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. If you're not going to let me go and all my men, let me leave a few men behind so that they can protect you." But he said, "What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord." So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. Now here's another principle of reconciliation, and this would be the final principle, and that is this: reconciliation does not always lead to a long-term friendship or relationship. You may reconcile with somebody, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to lead to a long-term relationship or friendship. You know, the only other recorded time that we know that Jacob and Esau got together was at their father's funeral in Genesis chapter 35. There's no indication, although maybe the scripture's just silent about it, there's no indication that Jacob ended up going to visit his brother in Seir, which is the land of Edom, and vice versa. You can reconcile with somebody, you can forgive somebody, and you know what? You end up parting company, and you don't have a long-term friendship or relationship with that person. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. I have had falling outs with people over the years, and we've made up, and we've genuinely forgiven one another, but we haven't talked since then. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. I remember a man, I was preaching a series one time, I think I was in the Gospel of Luke, and I was talking about divorce and remarriage as Luke was explaining it. And this particular gentleman came up to me days later and he said, "You know what? While you were preaching," he said, "I got convicted. I have been divorced from my wife for so many years, and she has remarried. And I think they got divorced when they were both non-believers. He's now a believer. I can't remember if his ex-wife is a believer." He says, "But we've been divorced for years, and I realized that I was the culprit. I was the problem in the marriage." And he said, "While you were preaching, I got convicted that I needed to contact my ex-wife," and I thought he was going to say, try to get back with her, and I was going to say, no, she's remarried. You don't want to do anything like that. He said, "No." He said, "My motive, if I can get back with her, is to simply apologize to her and say, I was wrong for what I did." And I thought, wow, that's genuine repentance. You know what? If he ever did that, he could have apologized to her and maybe they would be on good terms, but you know what? They're not going to have an ongoing friendship. I know some do after they get divorced. In fact, I've had people say to me, "After my divorce, I got along better with my spouse than I did when we were married." Now, that's not a reason to get divorced, but some people that happens. Well, notice as we close here, in verse 17, Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built for himself a house made of booths for his livestock. Therefore, the place is named Succoth. Now, obviously, this is a temporary shelter because he's moving towards the promised land. And it says, now Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. He bought the piece of land where he had pitched his tent from the hand of the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. So he finally arrives in the land of Canaan, having been away for 20 years. And then it says in verse 20, then he erected there an altar and called it El Elhoi Israel, which means in the Hebrew, God of Israel. Now let me show you the map here, and you'll see where he went. You'll notice on the bottom there, on the right in the white, Sukkot, that's where he originally camped. That was a temporary shelter there. And then he eventually moved on and he went to Shechem. And that's where he actually set up permanent camp because he bought the land while he was there. Now, I want to bring out an interesting insight here as we close, because this shows us how Jacob was entering into a deeper relationship with God. I want you to notice, go back to the verse on the PowerPoint, the previous verse we looked at. Look at verse 20. It says, then he erected there an altar and called it El Elhoi Israel, which means God, the God of Israel. Now remember, God changed Jacob's name from Jacob to what? Israel. So notice what he's saying here. He builds an altar, he worships God while he's in the promised land now in Shechem. He buys that land, he builds an altar, and then he names the area God, the God of Israel. You say, what's the significance of that? Well, the name that he gives here shows he's entering into a deeper relationship with God. He's more surrendered to God. Why? Well, the way to understand this is look at Genesis 31, verse 42. Notice what Jacob says. If the God of my father, the God of who? Abraham, the fear of Isaac had not been with me, certainly now you would have not sent me off empty-handed. Notice how he refers to God here. The God of his father Abraham and the God of his father what? Isaac. Notice he doesn't say in Genesis 31, the God of Jacob. He refers to God as the God of Abraham and Isaac. Notice, if you will, Genesis 32, verse 9. Look what he says. Then Jacob prayed, O God of my grandfather Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, you told me, return to your own land and to your relatives, and you promised me I will treat you kindly. Notice in that prayer in Genesis 32, he doesn't mention the God of Jacob. He says the God of Abraham, and he says the God of Isaac, but he never says the God of Jacob. Finally, here in this chapter, in verse 20, when he erects the altar, he doesn't say the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac. He says, finally, the God of Israel. In other words, Jacob's relationship, it was now his God. It was no longer the God of his parents. It was no longer the God of his grandparents. It was now his God. And you see, that name change reflected the fact that Jacob's relationship with God had been cemented. Jacob entered into a deeper relationship with God. And you know what the point is here, people? Sometimes we have to have crises in our life. We have to have encounters with God where God becomes our God. He's not the God of my parents. He's not the God of my pastor. He is a God that I now have an intimate relationship with. And prior to this, Jacob did not have that relationship. And you see, there are many Christians in the American church, they can quote the Bible, they know about God in their head, they can talk about the God of their pastor, but here's the question, is God personal to you? Do you have that intimate relationship with God where you have owned your own faith? You see, a lot of Christians haven't owned their own faith. You know what happens? They come to church, they listen to a sermon, they go home, and that's the extent of their Christianity. They're not in the Word that often, and you know what? They don't have that walk with God. They don't have that encounter with God. You see, Jacob got to that point here where he finally builds an altar and he says, the God of Israel, the God of Jacob. How about you? Do you have that intimate relationship with God? So what have we learned this evening? We've learned about surrender and reconciliation. God wants all of us to surrender daily to Him. Christianity is not just about coming to church, hearing a sermon. Christianity is a relationship with God where I yield myself in loving obedience to my Father because I want to do His will. And when I don't, I confess and repent. Not out of fear, not out of cowering fear. The Bible says the fear of the Lord brings wisdom, but that fear is a reverence towards God. It is not a cowering fear. God wants us to surrender. Are you surrendered this evening? Or are you just playing church? Or are you just showing up because that's what you do in the South? You come on Wednesday night, you come on Sunday, and you do what you're supposed to do. Would you say in your heart you desire to surrender to God? And then secondly, is there someone that you need to be reconciled to this evening? Is it a marriage partner? Is it a child? Is it an in-law? Is it a parent? You say, Mike, I've tried to reconcile and they're not interested. Well, you know what the Bible says? As far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. If you've done what you are called to do, then you know what? There's nothing else you can do at that point. Well, I can't, Mike, because my parents are dead. Well, you know, all you can do is if they've hurt you is forgive them and move on. You can't do anything if they've passed on. But if there's someone that you have anger towards, that you cannot let go and it's gotten in your craw and you can't get rid of it, the Bible says to go to that person and make it right. Because here's the deal, people. If we hold on to bitterness and anger and we're not willing to get the horizontal relationship right, the vertical relationship is not going to be what it needs to be. Because Jesus said, before you make your offering, go get it right with your brother.